Hi everyone, welcome back to our webinar series on IRRICAD. Thank you for attending. Our webinar will be recorded, so you'll have the opportunity to see it again if you wish. Quick introduction of our team. My name is Graham Hutchinson. I'm with Nelson Irrigation here in Walla Walla, Washington. Mike Noftal, independent consultant, Washington State. Mike is our presenter today. Steve McCoon, Nelson Irrigation, Walla Walla, Washington. Joe Vivier is in New Zealand with IRRICAD and is the global support person for IRRICAD. And Ignacio Del Campo with Nelson Irrigation in Chile in South America. We are at number 5 in our webinar series. Today's topic is the irrigation block tools and subdivision tools, and Mike Noftal will be going through that. So I will hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Hutch. Let me set up some screen sharing here. Okay, so are we seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes, coming through clear.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, thanks, Graham, and thanks for everybody who's able to be in attendance today. I want to spend some time with you today on irrigation blocks. And when we talk about irrigation blocks, we're primarily going to talk about 2 types of irrigation blocks. We're going to talk about spray irrigation blocks, which are essentially sprinkler laterals or outlets. And also we'll talk about tape irrigation blocks, which are drip tapes, drip lines. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time on how to take those primary blocks that we create and subdivide them in a way that's logical in order to create the number of blocks that we want total in the project. So let me share with you my—
While you're getting that up, Mike, I forgot to mention to everyone, please use the question and answer feature of Zoom to post questions, and the rest of the team will do our best to answer you. Para los asistentes de habla español, se puede hacer preguntas por el menú de preguntas y respuestas. Trataremos de contestarlas en español. Thank you, Mike.
Okay. All right. So I have my IRRICAD screen open. Hopefully everybody can see that. And we want to go through quite a few things today, so we'll get started right into it. We're going to start here with just a simple rectangular shape, and we're going to talk about creating spray irrigation blocks. And so the way to do that is to select this boundary that we want to use to define our block. And once we do that, we are going to invoke the tool to create a spray irrigation block. There's a toolbar button for it that I have here, as well as under the zone menu, you can find it as spray irrigation block. So when you select spray irrigation block, you're going to get a pop-up. Because we've selected this closed boundary, IRRICAD's wanting us to verify that we want to use this closed boundary to define our block entity. And so in this case we do. So we're going to hit yes. And we're going to get a pop-up here that allows us to configure our spray irrigation block. So we can do things like specify pipe sizes for the lateral. We'll leave it at computer selected. So IRRICAD will have the opportunity to do some hydraulic calculations and determine that or suggest those sizes for us. We also choose a sprinkler that we want to use. And so when we choose a sprinkler, we're basically choosing the generic sprinkler body. And then we also choose the nozzle that we want that would be associated with that sprinkler. So you'll see there's a drop-down list here, and you can choose from a whole range of nozzles that are associated with that sprinkler in the database. So we'll just stick with this nozzle here. And you see that we have some pre-configuration information here based on some default settings in the database on how that that nozzle is created. So it has 40 PSI, but let's say we want a target pressure of 35 psi. So at 40 psi, the flow would be 1.36 gallons per minute. But when we change it to 35 psi, we'll see that that's going to drop down to 1.27 gallons per minute flow for each of the outlets in this block as we create it. This section here is for choosing a riser. So depending on what type of system you're doing, sometimes whether it's a polyline system or a PVC system for the laterals, you'll want to choose an appropriate riser. The riser is the connection from the sprinkler outlet to the lateral pipe itself. So if we just choose a 1/2-inch PVC riser, that'll do the job for what we're looking at today. A couple other things that we want to choose is we want to choose our lateral spacing. So our lateral spacing is going to be the spacing between the sprinkler lines. And let's set that to, let's say 30.
Mike, there was one or two comments that they're not hearing you very well. I can hear you well, but if there's something that you can do at your end to increase the microphone level, that might be good.
Okay, I'll crank it up just a little bit here. Outlet spacing. Outlet spacing is going to be the spacing down the lateral line between sprinklers. So that's essentially our sprinkler spacing. And let's say we set that to 27. So when we talk about spray lines, there's a couple types of spray lines. And I think, Graham, you talked about it a little bit in yesterday's session, but just to touch on it real quick and where you can affect it in the process of creating the block is when we talk about spray lines, we're talking about a zone pipe that contains regularly spaced outlets or sprinklers down its length. And there's two types. One is connected and the other is unconnected. So with a connected spray line, IRRICAD sees that primarily as one long sprinkler line, and it makes some assumptions on elevation being consistent from one end to the other. And that works well, especially when you have very little slope or a consistent slope. But if we go to unconnected, that's a little bit different scenario. In that scenario, IRRICAD is going to look, as it lays out the laterals, it's going to lay them out as individual segments connecting each sprinkler. So rather than one long lateral line, we're going to have several pipe segments in between each outlet or sprinkler all the way down the line. And the reason or the usage for this that makes it a better option oftentimes is when you have an inconsistent slope, undulating terrain, because in the process, IRRICAD looks at the elevations at the end of every single pipe segment. So at every single outlet down the entire line, and can give us a much more accurate analysis and result if we have that type of terrain. So we're going to leave it as unconnected, and I'll show you what that looks like when we get through the process. A couple other things that we'll leave for now. We'll leave a rectangular spacing, and we can go to the block tab and look at a few other things. Headlands and sidelands, that's a tool that's useful when we have a perimeter boundary like we do here. If we're going to lay in the laterals in a north-south direction, then the headlands would be space between the edge of the boundary of the field and the end of the last lateral. So we're saying we want a 15-foot gap between the end of the lateral and the beginning of the boundary. Sidelines, similar. It's a side. If we're north-south, it would say sidelines would mean sidelands. In this case, 15 feet would mean we want a 15-feet buffer on either edge so that the laterals would not bleed all the way to the boundary. We'll leave those at 15 feet. Submain properties, we'll talk about this section just a little bit. Under submain properties, if you leave it at computer selected, you're asking IRRICAD down the road as part of the design process to help you come up with the best sizes, the optimal sizes, according to the characteristics of the block and any potential elevation, that sort of a thing. if you wanted to fix, now when we talk about submain, we're talking about the zone pipe that connects the laterals and connects back to the zone valve. If you wanted to assign a particular size, you could do that. And that would make all the manifold pipes connecting the laterals all the same size. So in this case, we'll leave it as computer selected. A couple other options here. We can choose where we want the submain to be automatically located. There's a couple options in here. And we can even do it manually. And after the fact, we could draw it in manually with our cut pipe tool. But we'll leave it at start for now and see what that looks like. We can specify a depth for our submain, and we can specify a stub length. We'll leave that at 5, and I'll try to remember to show you what that looks like when we get out into the design. Control valve properties. We can have IRRICAD automatically populate the control valve on the block entity when it's created. And again, we can drop down from a list of valves. When you use this drop-down list, you can choose from a listing of valves. Now, these valves and the pipes that we talked about earlier are all based on what's enabled for usage in the database. And we'll spend a lot more sessions covering database stuff. But what's available here is based on what's made available out of the database. And you can see to the right here, you get a range of flow. So this 3-inch valve in the database is entered as allowing anywhere from a minimum of 50 to a maximum of 800 gallons per minute. Something like a butterfly valve would not potentially have a minimum flow, but when you have a regulating valve, often you'll have a minimum flow. So you can see what the range of the valves is, the flow range for the valves, and choose the one that makes the most sense for what you expect. We'll leave the position of the valve in the center in this case, but you could choose it to be on either end or by percentage. So let's say you want it to be 25% down the lateral, you could specify that as well. We'll leave it at center, we'll leave the depth where it is, we'll leave the valve stub where it is. We won't spend time in the flushing tab other than real quick to look at it and say, if you wanted a flush manifold at the end of your lines, you could specify pipe size and what type of a flush valve you might want. You'd have to toggle on create manifolds to have those created. We won't do that today, just in the interest of all the other things that we want to cover. So it looks like we initially have something here we can work with. So we're going to hit OK. And remember down here in the lower left-hand corner, if you can see that, oftentimes IRRICAD's telling us what it expects to do next when we're in the middle of a tool. So it wants us to select the lateral direction from the boundary. So if we were to select this north boundary, it would lay in the laterals parallel, so they would be east-west. In this case, we're going to go with north-south laterals, so we will select this west boundary, and we'll see that we have created, or we're in the process of creating. IRRICAD says, this is a newer feature, I believe in version 18, so, but IRRICAD says here, it pops up a window and says, hey, down here where this symbol is, this is where I was expecting to put the submain based on what you told me. But if you wanted it to be on the other end, then you can hit no. Or if you hit the wrong thing. Okay, so in this case, what we have now is the submain across the bottom with a valve here on a 5-foot stub. And then we have past our last lateral, we have our submain stub of 5 feet. Now, if we wanted this submain to be on the north end instead of the south end, we could do that pretty easily. There's a couple ways to select the block. We can either select the irrigation in the select object mode. We can select the irrigation area boundary that defines the block. Or one way that's handy sometimes is if the laterals are visible and you hold down the Alt key, you can double click on any of the lateral segments of the block and it'll do the same thing. It'll select the block and allow us to reconfigure some things. So if we wanted the submain on the other end, it'd be easy enough to just go from end to start, and we hit OK here, and we're going to flip the submain to the other end. Now, you can see all these circles here, and they make things a little bit hard to see. What they are is they are the representation of the outlet radius based on each of the outlet locations. But we can turn that off. Over here on the layer bar, we'll see that the outlet wetted radii layer has data on it. It's green instead of gray, the little block next to it. So if we deselect or turn that off, then we have gotten those all out of our way. And we see here what we expect, which is a submain across the top, a valve on top of our 5-foot stub, and our rectangular spacing with laterals 30 feet apart and outlets 27 feet apart. So we can look at reconfiguring some things. This is the beauty of using block entities instead of just laying out individual spray line components, is that they're defined as a block, so things can be edited and changed much easier. So if you've decided that you want to make a change, it's as easy as in the select mode, double clicking on the boundary. And you can make any change that you want to here. You could change, obviously, sprinkler nozzle, but you can do something like change, let's say we want the submain, instead of being on the end, we want it to be through the center. So we can hit OK, and automatically IRRICAD's going to reposition the submain through the center, and we'll still maintain our valve in the center as we had specified. So a couple other things to talk about. Now that we have a sample to look at, we can talk about our options here of a rectangular spacing and a triangular spacing. So you can see here that we have a rectangular spacing. We have a square spacing essentially here between our outlets. So each of the outlets on each row are on the same horizontal plane with each other. But if we wanted to do a triangular pattern, the default would be a 50% offset. We hit OK, and we're going to see something a little bit different here. We're going to have an alternating pattern so that we have a triangular pattern, and on the second lateral, the first outlet is 50% of the way down, and then we alternate back and forth across the block. So in all actuality, a triangular spacing at a 50% offset and a rectangular spacing at a 50% offset also gives you the same triangular results. Where IRRICAD is, where there's a little bit of a nuance in it, is if we were to do something different, like let's say we did a 25% offset. In that case, with a 25% offset on a triangular spacing, we're going to get something that looks like this. Pretty similar, except for this second lateral first outlet is just 25% offset from the initial outlet. So, and then we alternate back to the original location on the third lateral, down the 25% offset on the fourth, and so forth. Now that's with a triangular spacing on a 25% offset. A little bit of a nuance is if we were to go with a rectangular spacing with the 25% offset, we're going to get a slightly different result. In this case, IRRICAD, instead of alternating back and forth, every lateral adds the 25% offset. So the first sprinkler lateral, then we go to the second lateral, the first outlet is 25% offset. And then instead of alternating back up to the top on the third lateral, we've gone another 25%. So we have a little bit of a different pattern there. And when we get to the fourth lateral and we've offset another 25%, well, that leaves us room that IRRICAD puts another outlet here as well. So a little bit different spacing concept, triangular versus rectangular when you have something other than a 50% offset. So that's good to know, so you can set it up the way you want it to look. While we're in here, we'll also go to this options tab. So we won't touch everything in here now because some of it we'll touch when we start talking about the tape irrigation blocks. Let's talk about the reference outlet. This is particular to spray line blocks. So the reference outlet is the initial outlet that's created, and by default, IRRICAD determines that automatically based on what you've configured. So let's say you have an initial outlet, and what that outlet is all the other outlets emanate from there based on the spacings that you've defined. So if we're happy with letting IRRICAD choose where the reference outlet is, then that's fine. But we can also come in here and do a user-defined location for the outlet. So if we were to do that and hit user-defined and go out of here, we could click on any lateral anywhere we want to and tell it where the reference or the initial outlet is, and IRRICAD would respace based on the spacings that we've given and configuration we've given, but use that as the primary outlet for the reference. So we won't spend time doing that. I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that so you can see where that was. You can also do this initially when you create the block. You can come into the options section and you could set it as user defined from the onset. And then as part of the process of creating the block, when you go out, IRRICAD will ask you to choose the reference outlet. We won't talk much about group spacings here because we're going to talk about it when we get to the tape irrigation blocks. But also here we can change the lateral direction if we want to. So if we've already created the block, we could come in here and toggle that to change, and we could make a change. We go out of here, and maybe we wanted these laterals to be east-west after all, and we could come in and select a new boundary line. Or if we did user define, we could click any 2 points on the screen, and that would tell IRRICAD what the lateral direction needs to be, and it would recreate the block based on that. Let's spend a little bit of time here in this section. And one of these is a brand new tool available to us now only in the latest release that's just been released. But regulated submain minimum pressure. So this is a scenario where if we want to, in this case, without this toggled on, IRRICAD assumes that there's no pressure regulating device of any kind where the submain manifold connects to the sprinkler laterals. If you wanted to account for a pressure regulating device at that connection point across the entire block, you could choose the regulated option, and then you would need to choose a minimum submain pressure, and that would need to be chosen essentially based on how much pressure the regulator itself needs to operate. So you're going to want to choose a pressure that's somewhat above your target outlet pressure. So let's say we had that set to 35, but we want to give ourselves a minimum pressure of 40 psi in the submains, so that the pressure regulator has enough pressure to work with to regulate down to the pressure that we need it to. So we can set that up there. Another thing we'll talk about is this extra outlets on the ends. So if you can see out here on the block, we have in this configuration, let's look at this third lateral. We have an outlet here, but we have quite a bit of space between the last outlet on the line and the end of the line. In this case, we have an outlet with just a little bit of space, not that much. So the coverage here on the end is probably going to be fine. But on a few of these laterals where there's not an outlet at the very end and there's a fair amount of space to the first outlet, we may not be happy with the coverage we get there. So IRRICAD allows us the option to place extra outlets on the ends of the laterals. And the way it thinks about that is if the distance between the outlet and the end of the lateral is 50% or more of the outlet spacing, then it will add an extra outlet. If it's less than 50% of the outlet spacing, it will not add an extra outlet. So let's choose the extra outlets option, and we'll hit OK here, and we'll see what kind of result we get. If you watch here, you'll see where extra outlets are added and where they're not. So we hit OK, and you can see that extra outlets were added here and here, but not here because the spacing didn't justify it. Same thing down here on the bottom end. We've got some extra outlets to make sure we have some good coverage. So that's a handy tool to be able to make sure we have good coverage that we're comfortable with on the ends of our laterals. One last thing we'll talk about under the options tab is this trim ends option. So this is new to version 19. And what it does is it allows, or it trims back the lateral end back to the last outlet on the line. So if we initiate that and OK out, we're going to see that the laterals have all been trimmed back to the last outlet on the line. See if there's anything else we need to go through there. There's no way we can go through every possible option, but we want to make sure we touch as much as we can. I think that will cover. We'll cancel out of there. I think that'll cover for us. Now, as Graham talked about a little bit yesterday in the last session, going through the process of designing, once we have the block laid out, in this case, it would be as easy as coming in here to the design tool, choosing LP design, and letting IRRICAD come up. Oh, that's because I had set it to pressure regulated. But you can see that IRRICAD now has colored these pipes based on the design parameters that we gave it. If you're in the select object mode, you can double click on any of those pipe segments. IRRICAD will tell you what size it's chosen. So in that case, we start with 3/4 or 3-inch PVC down to 1.5 inch PVC in the submain manifold. And our laterals start with 3/4 inch, this green color, and we're ending with 1/2 inch. So that's a good basic layout. And what we'll do now is we'll move over here to this next shape that I've created so we can talk a little bit about tape irrigation blocks. So a tape irrigation block is for drip tapes, drip lines, whether that's a tape type product or a hose type product. If it's got low flow emitters down the length of that drip line, then we would use the tape irrigation block tool. So we're going to select this boundary again, and we have a tape block entity tool button, or we could invoke the tool from the tape irrigation block section. Again, it's going to ask us if we want to use the selection to define the block. We do. We're going to get a pop-up window here for configuration. It's going to look similar to the one for the spray irrigation blocks, but it's going to have some differences. Again, we can choose the tape that we want, and there's a drop-down list from all the ones that are enabled in the database. This is just a training database with some generic items in it, so we'll just go with that one there. Again, we can choose the regulated option if we want to. We have a target inlet pressure of 8 psi. So that's the pressure that we would like IRRICAD to work towards at the beginning of each drip line as it connects to the submain manifold. If we want to choose regulated, then we would again put a submain minimum pressure. So depending on what kind of regulating device or what we're doing to control pressure going into the inlets of the drip lines, we would want to maybe put a pressure in there as a submain minimum pressure that gives IRRICAD a little bit of room to work with in that process. We need to choose a lateral spacing. So let's choose something like 5 feet. Whoops, not 58 feet. We'll talk about this section in a minute. Let's go lateral direction. We'll leave that at determine automatically as well. And what that's going to do, well, I'll show you as we go through the process, but IRRICAD's then going to ask us to select a boundary to define the lateral direction. Let's go into the block tab real quick. Let's say we want the submain at the start. We'll leave the headlands. We're pretty much happy with all that other stuff. So we'll hit OK here, and then IRRICAD again is telling us to select the lateral direction from the boundary. So we could choose any lateral direction. If I were to choose this segment here, then the laterals would all be laid parallel to that segment. If I'm happy with the submain location being here based on the preview, I can hit yes. It's going to put that valve in the center and the submain across the bottom. We can make any changes we want to, just like with the spray irrigation blocks, by selecting the boundary within the select object mode or holding down the Alt key, double clicking on any of the laterals. If we wanted to do something like we want the valve to be at the start instead of in the center, we could do that, and IRRICAD would automatically make that change for us. A couple other things. I'll go back in here so we can talk about a few things. We can talk about, well, lateral direction. Changing that is easy enough. We want to select the change option. If we leave it at determine automatically, then IRRICAD's just going to ask us to select a new boundary to define the lateral direction. And so we can do that. And IRRICAD now is going to reconfigure the orientation of the laterals based on that new boundary line that we chose. And again, with the submain connected to the ends with the valve on the corner. There's a couple other things we can also do in this section that are worth talking about. We talked about having the submain at the start or the center, but one of the options that can be handy is if we want the submain to be down in the block and not necessarily in the center, we can choose the set distance option. So when we choose set distance, then this distance input area becomes active, and we can tell it what we want that distance offset to be. And when we hit OK out of here, IRRICAD is going to ask us to select the line parallel to the submain that we want to use as our offset. So if we select this boundary line on the north end, IRRICAD has now offset the submain by 100 foot from that boundary line that we selected. One other thing that we'll talk about in here is this alternate lateral layer. So this can come in handy mostly from a visual perspective. Oftentimes, you want to have some of the drip lines or, some of the drip lines visible, but not all of them, because it can be clustered, especially on a tight spacing with a drip tape block. But sometimes you want to have some of them visible so that you can have some labeling that makes sense and that sort of a thing. So you can set an alternate layer, lateral layer interval. And let's say we set that to something like 15. When we hit OK out of here, it doesn't look like there's any changes that have been made. But what IRRICAD has done is it's taken every 15th lateral and moved it to a different layer. So that if we go over here to our layer bar and we go to the spray lines layer where the laterals are created by default, and we turn that layer, the visibility of that layer off, we're going to see that we're still able to see every 15th lateral, every 15th drip line. So if we want that for our visual when we create some printouts or presentation to the grower, and we can have some labeling and that sort of a thing, we can do that. Now, those laterals have been moved by default to the IRRICAD layer. You can specify what layer that you want them to be moved to, or you could create a new layer, but by default, they're moved to the IRRICAD layer. So if I turn the IRRICAD layer off, we'll turn all the laterals off. We'll see the submain still here. I've got the zone junctions visible. You can always turn those off under the zone junctions layer. But if we turn the IRRICAD layer back on and the spray line layer back on, we have all of our all of our laterals, all our drip lines visible again. See if there's anything else in there that we want to touch. I think we're good. Let's do this. Let's look at one other configuration option for drip, for tape irrigation blocks. That's a brand new feature to version 19, and I'm showing it to you because I'm excited about it. We will do another webinar down the road that covers all the new features of version 19, but I want to show you a few in the process here as it makes sense during this webinar. So we have a shape here, boundary line that has a curved boundary to it. So this may be a pivot corner or anything to that effect. And we've also created another line here that intersects our closed area on both ends and essentially runs offset from our curve of our boundary. So if we select the boundary, again, go into the tape block entity tool. Yes, we're going to confirm that as we have on all the others. And this is where we're going to go into a section here with this new feature. So normally when we do user defined and we go out, IRRICAD's just going to say, hey, click 2 points on the screen that define the lateral direction. But we want to have a polyline lateral that follows the arc of this boundary here. And so there's two options. One would be draw a polyline, and then so when we go out of there after the fact, IRRICAD would ask us to basically trace or draw the polyline that defines the direction. But since we already have a line that we've created that takes that into account, we can just use this select line. So select polyline to select an existing polyline to define as the planning direction. So we do that. Maybe one thing we need to change here is to have that at the start. But let's go back. So we have user defined, select the polyline, and we hit OK. And IRRICAD asks us to select which line we want to use to create our polyline laterals. So we're going to select this line, and then we see that IRRICAD has automatically gone into the process of laying out the laterals in that arced fashion that fits offset from the boundary, from this interior boundary here. So again, it's going to ask us where we want to place the submain or confirm where we want to place the submain. So we're happy to do that there. And now it's asking us if we want to confirm the valve position. So we'll also have the valve down here in this corner. We hit yes. And we can see that we now have a block of arced tapes following that polyline with submain along the ends and up the side, connecting all those laterals back to a control valve. So, so that's a little bit on the tape irrigation blocks. We've covered spray irrigation blocks and tape irrigation blocks. I'm sure there's questions. We don't have time to touch every single thing. So keep using that Q&A and we'll try to get those questions answered for you. But wanted to give you an overview of those things. So the thing that we'll do now with the rest of our time is I'm going to open up a new file here that's got some pre-configured stuff for us that'll make things a little bit quicker, hopefully. Is we're going to talk about, now we have this master block or primary block, and maybe we want to subdivide this into smaller blocks, and we're going to go talk through that process a little bit here. So again, if I turn the spray lines off, you can see we have a block here defined by this boundary with submain across the top, connecting those drip lines. We're going to do this with drip lines. It's virtually the same with spray lines, but we're going to go do this with drip lines in the interest of time. We have our valve in the center. That's how we've configured it. So we can turn the spray lines back on. Again, we want to select this block and we want to go into the subdivision tool. So in the select object mode, instead of double clicking on the boundary or on one of the laterals using the Alt key to bring up the properties, we just want to select it so we can invoke the subdivision tool. So In that case, in the select object mode, holding down the Alt key, we just click on one of the drip lines, and we'll see that the boundary has been highlighted green to let us know that it's been selected. So in that case, we've selected the block by selecting the block boundary, and we can go to the Subdivide tool. There's a tool button for it here, or under the Tools menu, Subdivide Block. So again, we'll cover what we can here. We may not cover every single thing. Again, use the Q&A, but let's talk about this a little bit. So we have some information across the top when we get this pop up here for configuration on subdivision, and it tells us what our overall area is. And then irrigated area is going to be the area after factoring in our headlands and our sidelands. So 33 total acres in the perimeter of the boundary. 32 of those acres will be irrigated after factoring headlands. There's a total of 296 laterals or drip lines in this case. If we were to irrigate the entire thing at once, it would take 524 gallons a minute. And our longest lateral is 1,180 feet. In fact, they're all the same length, so they're all 1,180 feet. So there's some good information there. And then when we talk about subdivision, we talk about two things. We talk about slices and cuts. So a slice is going to be a subdivision of the area based on being parallel to the lateral direction. So let's go through that first. So in order to do that, we're going to isolate and just deal with slices. So we'll leave cuts at none. And we have some options here for slices. So the one that I think probably used most commonly is just the number option. So if we say we want to slice into 4, then what we're going to do is hit the OK button and get a preview of what that would look like. IRRICAD is going to subdivide parallel to the lateral direction into 4 individual blocks. Here we have a preview of what those blocks essentially look like in terms of acreage and flow. So when we use number as the directive, then IRRICAD does its best to subdivide those into equal flow and area. And if we hit accept the changes here, we're going to see that IRRICAD now has created 4 individual sub-blocks carrying through the same characteristics as the primary block, with submain across the top and valve in the center of each one. So if I turn off the spray lines to make that maybe a little more visible, you can see how that configuration is. Now I want to go back and forth through some scenarios, and the easiest way for me to do that is just to hit the undo tool here. So we're going to undo the last thing that we did in IRRICAD, which was the subdivision. When we do that, we're back into our original primary block. So if I invoke the subdivision tool again, we can look at, there's a couple different things here. Number isn't the only option. We can go by number of rows or total distance. So something like total distance might look like, let's say we put in a number of 200. If we put a number of 200 and maybe we put in a gap of 10, then every 200 feet along the width of this master primary block, IRRICAD is going to start a new block. So I'll just show you what that looks like real quick. It's going to be without regard to trying to have even area, because we have 5 here that are all 200 foot wide, and those 5 all have the same acreage. But then we have this leftover piece here that only is 3.5 acres and about 2 acres less than the other ones that are the full 200 foot wide. Obviously the flow is reduced here. So distance is just going to literally measure across the width and start a new block every time it's reached that distance that you specified. Same idea, if we accept that, then we're going to see that we've carried through the characteristics of the primary block into the subdivided blocks. We'll go back And we'll go back into the subdivision tool. So that would be very similar with rows. Instead of doing by distance, it would do it by lateral count. We can also use multiple options. So we don't necessarily have to, if we set this to 200 feet, it would make a change at every 200 feet. But we could come in here and make multiple. So maybe we want the first at 200 feet and the next one at 300 feet. So we could go in and populate these as multiple values for the slices, and it would make those adjustments based on those distances. Now let's talk about cuts instead of slices. A cut, well, first time around, let's set that to 3 cuts. Now a cut, by definition, is a block subdivision that is not parallel to the lateral direction. Typically, and by default, that's perpendicular to the lateral direction, but not necessarily. But let's look at this initially and see if we have cuts at 3, and we leave it at perpendicular to the laterals, and we hit OK. We're going to get something that looks like this. IRRICAD wants to create now our 3 subdivided blocks with a cut that is perpendicular to the lateral direction. So if we accept that, then again, we're going to see IRRICAD has carried through the qualities and created 3 blocks. In this case, they're stacked instead of side by side because we chose a lateral cut or a perpendicular cut direction. Again, there's a few options there as well. We don't have to, we can do the distance option as well, similar to slices. And we don't have to do perpendicular. There's a couple other options here. If we have a different boundary line that we want to use and make the cut parallel to that boundary line, we could choose that option, or we could choose a manual option. In the manual option, what we do is when we hit OK and go out of here, IRRICAD is going to ask us to specify 2 points that define that cut direction. So we may do something like click here and do something of an angle across here, and that's going to define that cut angle. So IRRICAD's still going to do 3 individual subdivided blocks, all of the same acreage and flow, but it's going to be cut based on that manual angle that we specified. And again, it's going to carry those properties all the way through. Let's undo. There's 1 or 2 other things I want to show you here with the time that we have left. Actually, let me cancel out of here. There's one other thing I need to do real quick. This is another feature that's brand new to version 19 that I'm also excited about. What we're going to do is we're going to create a polyline. It can be a straight line or a polyline, but we're going to create a line that crosses entirely through this block entity. So it intersects on both ends of the primary block. And what we're going to do is we're going to, again, select our block, but we're also going to select this line that we've created that intersects the block. And when we have a line that intersects the block and we also select it before invoking the subdivision tool, then we get into this new feature that's called manual cut option. So it senses that we had a line, an intersecting line selected, and it put us automatically into this manual mode. When it does that, it assumes that that line defines where we want to make a cut through the block. Now we could have multiple lines. We could have 2 or 3 of those lines passing through, and that would define for IRRICAD how many sub blocks we wanted to create. We can put a gap in there, let's say of 10 foot, but when we have this set at manual and we hit OK, IRRICAD is going to make a cut following that line, and it's going to use that line as the center of the cut. So if we put defined a 10-foot gap, then it's going to create that gap of 10 feet centered around that line. Now this comes in handy if you had like a canal running through a project, or a trough or low spot of some point, or a fence line, and that's a hard boundary that you know that you can't, that your block can't cross over, that would allow you to do that. So this is the result we get, again, with our submain across the top and our valve in the center. That's replicated on both of these. Let's say maybe one option or one thought is that we want to have this submain, instead of running up against this, this obstacle, maybe we want to have that submain on the bottom end. That's easy enough to do. All we have to do is select this sub block, and we can go into the block tab, and we can change it from start to end. And IRRICAD's going to move that submain to the other end. So in this case, we have our gap through here based on this polyline, and we have submain across the top and across the bottom with valves configured the way we asked it to be. So we want to talk about one more scenario with a little bit of time that we have left. We'll try to go through this really quick. Oftentimes, if we having a nice square or rectangular field is nice, but that's not always the case. Sometimes we end up with something triangular like this. And so if we want to use the subdivision tool on this, sometimes we have to think out in front of things a little bit. So let's say I want to have 3 equal size subdivided blocks out of this master block. And maybe I want something like a third of the field, or to be divided into 3, that this top piece would be a block. And on the bottom section, we would want a west side and an east side block. Sometimes that's not easy to do all in one step. So we have to think about how that might work in a multi-step process. So if I select that boundary, and go into Subdivide Block, we're going to do this in a couple steps, and we'll do it real quick and be done for the day. But let's leave slices at none. We're going to go cuts active. We're going to go 3 cuts. If we go 3 cuts and hit OK, we're going to get something that looks like this. We have 1, 2, 3 subdivided areas. This northernmost one is exactly what we were hoping for, but on the southern 2/3, we ended up with stacked zones, and instead we wanted side-by-side zones. So this is where we're going to use our join sub-areas tool. So in this case, we want to join sub-area 1 with sub-area 2. So we'll put those sub-areas in, 1 and 2, and then we will look at the changes. So what we've done is we've combined those 2 into one big block. Here now we can see that that block is 2 zones worth of what we wanted to achieve for our final result, but we'll accept that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go into this subdivided area, and we're going to select it, and we're going to go into the subdivide tool. And now we are going to deal with that smaller piece separately. We're going to make sure we don't have any cut set, and we're going to subdivide into 2 pieces. And when we do that, now we get the result we were hoping for, with a northern third, and then on the lower 2/3, a western third and an eastern third. And we can accept our changes there, and that's the result we get. So I think that's all the content we have for today. I used all the time and then some. But I wanted to make sure I go through this with you. If you have more questions, make sure you ask them. We're happy to answer them. I appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you, and that will finish up the content that we have for today. And Graham, I'll turn time back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was an excellent session. So thanks everyone for joining. We appreciate your attendance. The next seminar will be on Monday, and it will go over points of control, what we call points of control. And really that's how to configure the parameters within IRRICAD and some things in the database so that the end result meets your expectations and is also a successful design. So that's Monday at 11 a.m. and we will send out the links for that sometime this afternoon. So thanks again, and have a nice weekend.